Welcome, everybody, to another edition of the Trusted Trustee podcast. And again, I'm joined by Tracey Besters for this session. Hello, Tracey. How are you?
I am really well, Darin. Thank you very much. Hope you are doing well after the roadshow last week, the trustee events.
Yes, indeed. And of course, this podcast is brought to you by Superfund Property Valuations, ATO compliance in a click. If your SMSF accountant or auditor is on your back for a property valuation, just order an affordable report from the experts with ease using the details on your screen now. And as I keep reiterating, valuations is a very, very, very hot topic, especially in the eyes of the ATO. So it's certainly something that you should address and not bury your head in the sand and think that it will just go away, because it's not going to go away. So a great service there, and very, very topical. As Tracey mentioned, we've just come off our SMSF Trustee Empowerment Day. We did Sydney and Melbourne last week, which was fantastic to get in front of a lot of you trustees. Hopefully some of you who are listening and watching today attended the sessions. I think they were really good. A lot of good information, probably information overload, actually. It wouldn't surprise me if people were walking away from that and their heads swimming with information. But look, I enjoyed it. I hope you enjoyed it, Tracey. I know your session was very, very well received, as well as the fireside chat, which was actually without a fire, but anyway. But it was good fun. And actually, it's a pretty good lead into today. Up until now, we've spoken about how to get your money out of super. So we've talked about pensions and those sorts of options, as well as some of the other provisions in legislation that can allow you to access your super under certain circumstances. So one of the topics that was discussed quite interestingly during the day, or a lot of the questions, were around death. Cheerful topic, I know.
Very cheerful topic.
But I thought, on the back of what we discussed before, it's probably a good sort of introduction as to how death benefit or estate planning strategies can work in with pensions. And when I'm talking about this, I'm really talking about making your pension reversionary, so that when the original member receiving the pension dies, what happens to the pension after that? So we're going to go into a little bit of detail with that. As I said, really cheerful topic. But Trace, maybe we can start by just with some of the basics as to, if you want to make a pension reversionary, what do you have to do?
Yeah, great question, Darin. And just thanks for having me at the Trustee Empowerment Day last week. It was fun to be in Sydney and Melbourne, and our non-fireside chat, or non-fire fireside chat, was actually really good fun, and lots of great questions. And I think that just like we said the year before, we talked about contributions. We got loads of questions about pensions. We talk about pensions. We got loads of questions about death and estate planning. So, which is good that everyone is thinking about kind of, trying to put together their overall plan around this stuff. So that's good. And just a quick shout out. It was lovely to meet Will from Superfund Property Valuations in Melbourne last week as well, in person. So we often do things online so much. It's nice to actually meet people in person. So shout out to it as well. So in terms of reversionary pension, Darin, so this is a decision effectively when you commence a pension. So in our self-managed super funds, we talked about commencing a pension, and it's a physical decision that you decide to commence the pension. I mentioned in my session at the Trustee Empowerment Day that death is the only compulsory cashing requirement. So when you meet preservation age and you meet a condition of release, you can choose to start accessing your money from super. You don't have to access your money from super. That's a choice. When it comes to death, though, you don't have a choice. That money has to be dealt with in one way, shape, or another. So when we start to talk about the planning around commencing a pension, one of the terms and conditions that we can pop into our pension documentation, Darin, is this concept of reversionary. So effectively what that is a decision to say, well, I'm going to commence a pension, and then on my death, I want my pension to continue automatically to my husband, Jason. So I don't have to do that. I can just have the pension with no reversion, but I can actually choose to have that reversionary condition popped into my pension contract. And remember, the pension contract is between you and you, member hat and trustee hat. So it's a decision that you make yourself. You do need to check any specific requirements in your SMSF trust deed to see whether the trust deed has any specific rules around estate planning or what can happen to your benefits. Most of the ones I've read, the newer trust deeds haven't got any specific requirements. Some of the older ones had some, crazy rules, I think, but most of the new ones don't. So that's a decision that you make on the commencement of the pension.
Yeah, well, that's obviously, again, one of these situations where you have to start to think about what happens at the end, right at the beginning. And I know it sounds silly, but a lot of people actually don't take that into account. And obviously, if you start a pension and then and it's not reversionary, and then you want to change it later, it comes with a little bit of complication, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does, Darin. So if you so let's say that I've commenced a pension, and then a few years down the track, I talk to my advisors and I watch this podcast, and I hear about this concept of reversionary pension, and then I say, oh, that actually would suit me. I'd like to insert a reversionary pension into my documentation. Now, for most SMSFs, and I say most, not all, because clearly I haven't read all of the trust deeds that are available or reviewed all of the pension documentation out there. But for most SMSFs, you can't just change the conditions of that pension or the contractual obligations in that pension. So for most SMSFs, that would be a situation of commuting that pension, that's sitting in retirement phase, pulling it back into accumulation phase, starting a new pension with the reversionary pension conditions in that new pension. So it's not a matter of just saying, oh, I've changed my mind, now I want to insert my husband Jason into my into my pension and make it reversionary. It's a matter of ceasing the pension, rolling back, commuting back, starting a new pension under the new pension rules. So it's not quite simple. Nothing is, but it's not quite a simple change. There are some requirements there. And of course, that means that, we've spoken a bit about taxable and tax-free components. I'd probably like to spend a little bit more time on that in our future podcasts. But if we've got a pension that is 100% tax-free that I've commenced, and I commute that back into accumulation, then I'm potentially mixing that with some taxable money, and I don't then have just a pure tax-free pension moving forward. So we just need to, it really is important to think about the end in the beginning. And one of the things that I've been teaching for so long now is about this whole SMSF journey. And the second part of the training that I teach is around this concept of protecting yourself and protecting your family. So in the events of your death, how do you want to protect your family? And the reason we talk about it then is because we can have this conversation around, well, do you want an income stream to go to your spouse automatically so that the spouse doesn't need to actually do anything? They can just keep, receiving that income. Because then once we've actually dealt with that and we've made those decisions, or we've at least had that conversation piece, when we get to the fact of actually meeting preservation age, meeting condition of release, we already know that we want to have that reversionary pension in place. So it's really important to think about death.
Yeah, and as difficult as it is a subject to discuss, I mean, no one likes to talk about their own mortality. On that concept of addressing it at the start rather than at the end is because once death becomes a realistic thing, I'm not telling anybody that anything anybody doesn't already know, but obviously there's a lot of trauma that comes with a person who's nearing death or on their deathbed. How do you make rational decisions in those sets of circumstances when it's an emotionally charged and upsetting situation? So if you can take the emotion out of it and have some sort of rationality, brought to the situation, I think that's going to help everybody. As unpleasant as it is to discuss death, obviously nobody likes that. But you mentioned, Tracey, as we always do, that nothing is simple when it comes to these things. Might look simple on the surface, but it's not always so. So if there is a reversionary pension, and obviously, unfortunately, the original pension beneficiary dies, there are still obligations that need to be met, aren't they? It's not a matter of Jason saying that, oh, that was Tracey's pension. It's very nice that she's allowed it to revert to me, but I don't need to do anything in the interim, so I'm fine. I just absorb it, and off we go. But it's not quite that simple, is it?
No, of course it isn't, Darin. So effectively, this concept of a reversionary pension, it's not a different type of pension. So it's still either an account-based pension or a transition to retirement income stream. So it's still one of those two types of pensions. And so therefore, it still has to meet the standards, the minimum pension standards. So of course, that is minimum payments per year, the minimum percentage payment, and making sure that there's at least one payment in a year. So you can't just then say, oh, I didn't set it up. It's not my issue. It becomes your issue when you're the reversionary recipient. So there's still those requirements that have to be met. There's still the minimum percentage requirements. And, that then becomes important in discussing liquidity. So, how are those minimum pension payments going to be met? We talked about that in our last episode. A reversionary pension is no different than an account-based pension. So we still need to take into consideration all of those requirements that we talked about with our reversionary pension. I guess the big thing for me in terms of reversionary pensions and why we've used it effectively for clients in the past is that it just gives some sort of certainty, I guess. There's no actual decision making that has to take place, like you said, at the time when your loved ones probably don't want to have to make those extra decisions. And I just liken it to my family situation. My dad passed away very suddenly about 4.5 years ago now, and he actually didn't have a will. He didn't have a self-managed super fund, so that didn't have that complication, but he actually didn't have a will. So he left, his wife and children without that kind of certainty around what his wishes were. And I think that for me, using that example and knowing what we all went through in that situation, just kind of, hones it into, let's try and get this sorted out and let's make these decisions. And if you're making those decisions when both spouses, if it is a husband and wife situation, a self-managed super fund, then at least both spouses can have some input. And so, you can actually have that conversation at that point. We've also had, and this is a little bit comical, I guess, when talking about death, I'm sure it's a little bit macabre, really, but I've had a situation where clients in the past, the money in the wife's superannuation account was actually from her inheritance. And so she'd put contributions in over the years, whereas the husband, his money had come through contributions. And so the wife was actually quite specific with the husband's blessings that on her death, she was quite happy for her husband to have a reversionary pension for his lifetime, but she didn't want him to be able to then take a chunk of money out of the super fund if he had a new spouse. So we actually, there was quite a lot of conditions within their pension documentation. And you might say, oh gosh, that's definitely not keeping it simple. And it wasn't keeping it simple. But the point is that there are certain conditions that we can pop into some of these pension contracts to be able to meet the wishes of the member, and then help to provide for their beneficiaries. So the great thing about self-managed super funds, although it can be complicated, we can also give some customization to what the members want.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
That's the things we can do.
Tailoring to people's individual circumstances and wishes is so important. And one of the benefits of an SMSF, because obviously you want your wishes to be followed. Yeah. You can call it ruling from the grave, as some people like to suggest, but it is important. It is important for peace of mind and knowing that that's going to happen when I'm no longer here. Now, of course, any discussion around pensions, it would be remiss of us and impossible for us, really, not to talk about the implications of the transfer balance account and the transfer balance cap, because that involves some management too, particularly if an individual already has their own pension, their spouse or the other member has a pension too, but then it reverts back to the other member, and then all of a sudden they've got two pensions. So there's a little bit of juggling that needs to be done in that respect. Tracey, maybe you can talk us through some of that.
Yeah, sure, Darin. And you're absolutely right. So so if Jason and I have both commenced a pension, and my pension is reverting to Jason and I die, then he'll be the recipient of both his pension, his normal account-based pension, and then my death benefit pension, so the pension that I've reverted to him. So if he's well under the transfer balance cap, so the transfer balance cap will be 1.6 million, 1.7 million, or 1.9 million, depending on when he commenced. So it's nothing to do with me. It's when he commenced his initial account-based pension. Depending on how much cap space he has got, there's some decisions that he would have to make, because you can't exceed the transfer balance cap without penalties, right? So he has to do something. So if my pension reverts to him, then that's an automatic reversion. So he can't choose not to have that revert to him. So that's going to be, that choice is already made when that pension has commenced. So he will then have to decide he won't have to decide. He'll need to, in order to avoid that excess transfer balance cap arrangement, he'll need to actually do a partial or full commutation of his own pension, so that he's got enough cap space in order to be able to effectively receive my balance as a pension. So he can't just keep it, and this is one of those responsibility things. He can't just not do anything about it. He needs to make some decisions there. So the difference, and I guess one of the good things about having a reversionary pension, is that you get some time to make that decision, or to take those actions to do that partial or full commutation of your own pension. So if I was to die yesterday, and I always use yesterday as the example because clearly I didn't die yesterday, so that's a good thing. So if I was to die yesterday, then Jason would have 12 months from my date of death in order to be able to do something with his own pension, because it's not until 12 months from date of death that a reversionary pension will actually get counted towards his transfer balance cap. On the flip side, if we talked about just a death benefit income stream, and we'll probably do that more in the next podcast, you don't have that 12-month time frame up your sleeve. So you've got time with a reversionary pension, and that's one of the reasons that I like reversionary pensions. I'm not saying that a reversionary pension is appropriate for every situation, but if you want some certainty around what's going to happen, then certainly the reversionary pension can give you that certainty. So that time frame and that counting towards the transfer balance cap. If you're completely below the 1.6, 1.7, $1.9 million, you're never going to get close to that. Then, this conversation around the timing of counting towards that transfer balance cap probably isn't as relevant at all. But think about, life insurance and those sorts of things inside of the super fund, because although your account balances might not be as high now, add life insurance into the mix and you've probably got a fairly significant bump in the money we're talking about. So it might not be, it might not be on the forefront of your mind right now, but it may get closer. You might be closer to being capped out than you are right now.
Yeah, you raise a really good point there, but obviously the 12-month time frame is very important. But I think in a lot of the we call them war stories, that I hear from practitioners out there, is that 12 months isn't as long as it actually possibly seems. A year sounds like a long time, but with having to rejig your affairs and that sort of stuff, sometimes it's not actually that long a period of time, is it?
No, it's not, Darin. And we're talking about a really traumatic time in someone's life. They lose their loved one and they've got all of these things they have to deal with. We're only talking about what's happening inside of the self-managed super fund, let alone all of the things outside of super and all of the other estate planning things that need to be dealt with. And you're right, 12 months is not a long period of time. And I think that, For the reversionary pension and that, that concept and that strategy of should I have a reversionary pension or should I not have a reversionary pension, there's probably 2 or 3 key things that I think, lean towards having a reversionary pension for some people. One is the consistency of the income stream just being paid. So, if I died yesterday and I was due a standard, reversionary pension payment tomorrow, then that payment would be made to Jason. There wouldn't be any stopping and starting of those income streams. That payment would just be made. So when we're talking about, relying on income streams for our retirement and our living, then, that makes it nice and seamless. It's completely seamless. Nothing else needs to take place because all of those decisions and all of that documentation, as I said before, happens at the commencement of the pension. So we've already decided that. So that's the first one. The second one is that 12-month time frame. And although it's not a very long period of time, it still is something. It's still that we're not having to make that decision, in the next week or month or, 4 months or whatever, whatever that time frame is. We know that we've got that decision-making process. And I think the third part of it for me is that it does enable, I guess, that kind of conversation and decision-making to take place when you start the pension so that you both have input into that. And yes, I know that there is a way of, dealing with your wishes under a death benefit nomination or a binding death benefit nomination. But when we're talking about setting up the pension and having that be a seamless kind of flow through, then a reversionary pension does that very, very effectively. So that decision is made, like I said, at the very beginning. So there's a few reasons why you would have a reversionary pension. I guess the reason why you might not have a reversionary pension is because it may not allow for the flexibility that you might need when you get to that stage. So I'm not saying that you can't ever stop them, but I'm saying that seamless interaction, that seamless flow through might not be ideal, or might not be what you want on the death of your loved one.
Yeah, it's probably not a bad trigger point either to have or to commence conversations around this topic, because it's just an option for something that you're putting in place that probably needs to be addressed, rather than, right, Tracey, let's just talk about death, which I don't think anybody would be very receptive if you just approach the subject like that. So maybe it's actually not a bad icebreaker to look at some of the estate planning aspects of what you have to do in your SMSFs. Now, Tracey, I did want to establish, and I did want to let people know what the value of the pension is if it reverts, and like what date is the value effective? Is it when it goes to the reversion or reversionary beneficiary? Is it when the person actually dies, the original beneficiary dies? What is the value that people have to apply? And that's obviously very important if we're talking about transfer balance account and transfer balance cap management, because we've got to know what the value of the pension is going to be before they can actually strategize whether or not they've got enough cap space to accommodate that.
Yeah, great question, Darin. So under a reversionary pension, the value that gets credited to the recipient's transfer balance cap is the value at date of death. So not the value at the commencement. So if you actually, if you think about, so let's use an example. Let's use an example of property, right? So let's say that I died yesterday and we had property in our super fund, and that property increases dramatically in value in the next 12 months. Well, the value that we're actually crediting to the to Jason's transfer balance cap, or transfer balance account, I should say, that compares that then compares back to his transfer balance cap, is going to be the date of my death benefit pension as at the date of my death. Right. So if it goes up in value, we have a win. If it goes down in value, we don't have a win. We have a loss, another loss, because I've already died. But you actually, that's a good thing if you are going to have assets that increase in value, not such a good thing if those assets decrease in value. The flip side is if you're commencing a death benefit income stream, it's the value at the date that you commence the income stream. So it's not date of death. It's the date that the value of the date that you commence.
Yeah.
So yes, valuation is important, and establishing those valuations comes back to our whole conversations that we've been having about valuations over the last few episodes of the podcast as well. That you need to know those values. You've got to, you know, on date of death of somebody, there is quite a lot of SMSF administration that needs to take place, because you need to establish those values, and you need to you know, do the set of accounts to know what value you're actually doing, what value you're actually commencing a death benefit income stream if it's not reversionary, or what the value at date of death is for that 12-month later conversation of the crediting to the transfer balance account.
I know we do bang on a little bit about valuations, but it doesn't decry or it actually proves the importance of what it is, because you know, without knowing, you can't really strategize anything going forward if you don't have proper values of your assets, because how do you know? And there are so many thresholds. There are literally so many thresholds that you have to be aware of when you're running your own superannuation fund. And they play all different parts throughout all different strategies within your fund, that if you don't have your valuations right, then you'll be in a lot of trouble. Now, it's probably a good introduction to the last point we really should discuss. And no superannuation discussion right now would be complete without considering the Division 296 tax implications.
Yeah.
For those of you who aren't quite aware of the details, that tax is actually levied on an individual's total super balance. It's got nothing to do with the pool of assets in the fund. It is down to the actual individual. So Tracey, if Jason had $2 million as his total super balance, unfortunately you passed away, but you reverted a $2 million pension to him, all of a sudden his total super balance, when all of the dust settles, will be $4 million, and he will be caught by that $3 million threshold that applies to the Division 296 tax. So there's implications there that people have to be aware of as well, isn't there, Tracey?
Yeah, that is so true, Darin. And, you know, there isn't a carve out. There isn't an exception under the current way that the Div 296 is drafted for death benefit income streams, or the recipient of a death benefit. And I think that's a really unfair consequence, because, you know, again, we're dealing with so much on the death of our loved ones, and the last thing we want to be, you know, having to have a conversation with our advisors about, or, you know, for advisor to have a conversation to their clients about is, oh, by the way, you know, now we've got more tax to pay. Like, yippee, that's not a great thing at all. So that is an unfortunate consequence at the moment of the current draft of the Div 296. There's no carve out for that. And I've got clients in that situation, you know, right now, where you know, one client will be below the $3 million for the Div 296. Both clients are below, but on the death of one of them, they will automatically be above. And so that then leads to a whole lot of conversation around how to manage that Div 296, what we're going to do. I think the message that we certainly tried to get out at the Trustee Empowerment Days in Sydney and Melbourne is that we don't have final legislation. We don't have a final position. So we're not, yes, we're talking about it, but we're not actually making any strategy decisions at the moment, because we just don't know where the final legislation is going to land. And there's lots of lobbying going on. So, you know, it would be nice if some of that lobbying led to it not being introduced at all. That would be great. And that's fingers crossed situation. But, you know, dealing with unrealized gains and this unintended or unfortunate consequence about death benefits, and how to deal with that. There should be a carve out for death benefits. You should have time at least to rearrange your affairs. Just like this 12-month thing with reversionary pensions, we should have time to be able to rearrange our affairs, I think, on the death of our loved ones inside the super fund.
Yeah, certainly one of the main messages or takeaway messages when people were asking about Division 296 tax was try not to jump at shadows. We don't, because as you said, Trace, we don't know what's actually going to happen. We don't even actually know what's going to happen with the bill as it stands now, let alone any amendments that might be made if the bill actually does pass through Parliament. As you said, we remain hopeful that potentially it might not even come to that. But so we're obviously not suggesting that people should take action right now. It's just something to be mindful of, that if you are in this situation, then potentially this will be an issue. And this probably goes to the point where a lot of people will think that, oh, well, I'm on that $3 million. I don't have to worry about that. But
Yes.
there are certain factors that you might not have taken into consideration where your circumstances change. And then it's like, oh, but I thought I was okay. Now what do I do? So it's just something to be mindful of. We're not saying that you should act upon it or anything like that, because as we both acknowledge, it's still up in the air a little bit. So, well, a lot bit actually. But it's just certainly something to be aware of, and probably something to be aware of how more complicated your life will be if this policy comes in.
100%.
Certainly in this forum, we don't discuss it a lot. It's been discussed a lot amongst stakeholders. I can guarantee you that. We probably don't have as many discussions in the trustee world, but it is something just to be aware of. Don't act on it yet, but it's something that, it's going to be a big change. No doubt about that.
Absolutely, Darin. And I think, I think the point around that is, yes, we don't discuss it so much in the trustee world, but that's certainly not an indication of how much we discuss it in our professional world.
No.
And the strategies that we're all trying to come up with to be able to, deal with this whole horrendous Div 296. And I say horrendous, personal view, horrendous Div 296 tax. And I think that, there was a great question that one of the delegates at the Trustee Empowerment Day asked in Sydney, and it was around when should I review all of these things around pensions and, trustees and estate plans, and when should I review it? And the answer that was given to that particular gentleman in Sydney was, review things when your family circumstances change. So that's not necessarily going to be a set time frame every 4 to 5 years, for example. It's going to be whenever something happens in your family that you need to actually then readdress things, just to make sure that, okay, this significant event has happened in my family, and are my plans going to still fulfill my wishes? Have we still got this, this agreement between my plans and my wishes met? But the other trigger point is when legislation changes. And we had that in 2017 with the Better Simple Super rules. I managed to get a plug-in for that Better Simple Super rules. I don't know how I managed to do that in the podcast, Darin, but I did just then. So well done to me. We had to address a lot of things, and it was a trigger point for a lot of decision making, a lot of discussions. Div 296 will also be, once we've got, what we're dealing with, once we know what we're dealing with properly, that will also be a trigger for decision making, certainly around commencing pensions and reviewing pensions and estate planning. So protecting yourself, protecting your family, that conversation and that review and revision will be something that, advisors all around the country are going to be having with their trustees and with their members who have this potential Div 296. So raising it is a really valid point. And I think that, just because you're not affected by it whilst you're alive doesn't mean that someone is not going to have to deal with it on your death.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, these are obviously situations people are going to have to deal with. Probably haven't thought about it very much now, but again, I don't know whether or not intended or unintended, but there are a lot of consequences of that policy coming in, rather than just on the surface. If you're over 3 million or you're under 3 million, then you're off the hook. Yeah. Circumstances will change with existing strategies that people should definitely be conscious of. But Trace, we've run out of time again. As usual, we've got plenty to talk about, and we'll have to leave some of the other discussions for another day. But thank you very much, Tracey, for joining me on this version or this episode of the Trusted Trustee podcast.
My pleasure, Darin. And I look forward to the discussions that we're going to have around estate planning and death. I think that it is a morbid topic, and and unfortunately, it's something we're all going to have to deal with. And I think that the ability to be able to have our SMSFs to look after our family and protect our family on our death is a really valid thing. And so I look forward to having that conversation with you over the next few episodes.
Well, it's the only thing that's certain is that we all will die at some point in time. I'm glad you didn't die yesterday that you
Me
kept
too.
referring to, but we all will die at some point. Quick shout out again to our sponsor, Super Fund Property Valuations. Thank you very much. We really do appreciate your support. Thank you very much to all of you who are listening or watching this podcast. And again, a quick shout out. If you are enjoying this on YouTube, please remember to absolutely smash that like button and subscribe to the channel because it helps our matrix going forward. Other than that, we hope you enjoyed this episode of the Trusted Trustee podcast, and we look forward to you joining us again when we present the next episode of this podcast series. Thanks again. Have a great day.
See you then. Bye.